Telegraphy was a modality of colonial power. It was a means by which colonial power was enforced in India. And as an example, within the Telegraph Department, I identify three means by which, and this will sound suspiciously Foucaultian, but it is Foucaultian inspired by his analysis. It is an epistemic or an ideological kind of oppression that was enforced through the department, a bodily control, a bodily sort of regulation, and as well as a spatial control that was enforced.
The telegraph was not only an instrument of colonial power, but also for me, and this was a very important part of the document, an instrument of resistance to that colonial power, right? How would a history of telegraphy in colonial South Asia look like that, seeks to theorize from a global South perspective, not only from a global North perspective? Very often we talk about decolonization and the global South, but we don't always challenge.
How did these colonial class distinctions continue to reinforce these hierarchies after independence? So did you have a chance to look at what was being communicated and whether the control exerted by those in the higher sort of strands of this labor hierarchy within the office, whether that kind of control had any direct implications?
I wouldn't call it de-skilling. I mean, even though coal is a heavily manual, labor-intensive industry, but there is so much intellectual exchange that even happens in those spaces. How the telegraph system is actually a very global system in itself.
You have people like Elizabeth Losh in the US, Signal Corps, construction of telegraphic line, global resonances there. Then you have Hal Langford, who wrote about the subjugation of the Bororo Indians in Brazil, where the gender comes up here because the Bororo Indians are mobilized to put the cables and all of that, and the women were working, and women were producing the working matrilineal societies. Feminist orientations will look at how gender operates within the domestic setting.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The Global South Network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
GlobalSouth Network provide a platform for meaningful dialogue and cooperation, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN Network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
May I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayad, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN. The Global South Network is a much admired initiative.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, whole society, legal community, etc.
Quiero expresar mi sincero agradecimiento al Dr. Nauman Riad.
Dr. Nauman Riad, the founder and convener of the Global South Network. His visionary leadership has established a vibrant forum where judges, academics, and practitioners from around the world can share and exchange ideas. Initiatives like today's dialogue allow us to compare jurisprudence, share best practices, and develop common principles. This has the potential to contribute to transnational standards in procedure and enhance administrative law globally.
I would like to point out that Dr. Rayat's initiatives have not only enriched comparative judicial dialogue, have also fostered mutual understanding of the diverse challenges that courts face in safeguarding the rule of law and constitutionalism.
We can rule when we want in the cases which are brought to us by citizens and residents. In the EU, this openness of mind is increased by the fact we apply, in some cases, same norms from the EU treaties or the EU directives or regulations.
After all, what would you do as a colonizer from the global north, conditioned by a systemic othering mindset and driven by economic lust built on commodification, including the commodification of human beings?
Good afternoon or good evening for those who are in the UK. I'm here in Tennessee, US. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Sanjay Asthana. I'm a professor at the School of Journalism, College of Media at the Middle Tennessee State University. It's a public university in the United States. So the topic today, what's Indian about Indian Telegraph Department, exploring the human side of communication technology in colonial India. Part of the 47 online seminar, the Global South Network Online PhD in Progress weekly seminar series, phase 4, Jan to December 2025. So today we have Shibani Das, the PhD candidate in History of Technology, Race and Ethnicity in Empire. University of Exeter will present part of her PhD project titled What's Indian about the Indian Telegraph Department, exploring the human side of communication technology in colonial India. We have a few other guests here. I'm familiar with their work, especially Dr. Amelia, Bonea, lecturer in Global History of Science, Technology and Medicine, Center for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine, University of Manchester, for discussant of this panel here. Dr. Bhumika, Billa, Research Associate, Center for Business Research, University of Cambridge, is the second discussant. Then we have Shreya Count, a PhD candidate, Department of History, University of Warwick, as the peer commentator. And myself as your chair, and Nauman Riyad, who's the person who's organizing it. And it's a pleasure to be part of this panel and look forward to listening to Shibani. Thank you.
Allow me to first start off by thanking everybody for taking out the time to listen to me this morning. We all are extremely busy, and some more so than others. And I do appreciate the time and effort that we will spend over the next 1 hour trying to decode what makes sense in my research. To start off, I just wanted to outline and explain the heading of my presentation. This is a way of reminding myself that what I'm essentially doing in my research is reorienting the perspective of how we look at telegraphic communication in India. I have, through 3.5 years of research, understood that the one thing that's missing is looking at the entire infrastructure from an Indian perspective. It is both the subject and the focus of my research. And I keep reminding myself that that is what I need to be studying, who the Indian woman or man behind the network is. And that is the focus of my research and all of my work, even as a curator, which I will speak about just towards the very end. Perfect. So this presentation will limit itself to an assessment I make in one of my chapters. The assessment largely is challenging this idea of telegraphic networks as a gift, a colonial sort of grant to India, which often is a popular assumption about telegraphy, which is also something bestowed on railways, which is a sister infrastructure with telegraphy. But what I argue is that not only is it not a gift that encompasses concepts like modernity, civilization, or technological advancement, it was actively a means by which de-skilling and disciplining of human population or Indian employees happened within the department. The chronological time period that I focus on largely is the nationalist movement, specifically between 1920s and just a decade after independence, because I do feel personally that the moment of independence was not as much of a rupture as many of us might like for it to be. So I do extend my research a little bit into independent India as well. So just to give you some context, many of us are familiar, but for those of us who haven't gone into the nuances of telegraphic history, there's been a lot of research on science and technology, more so on sort of the pedagogy of science or the teaching of science in India, science policy and education, such as, for example, Science and the Raj, which is a very, very good example of that. But we step into, when we look at technology, a lot of work has been done, for example, on railways, on canal infrastructure, etc. But what often gets missed out in this conversation is a specific focus on telegraphy. It's oftentimes clubbed with the railways or clubbed with other engineering projects, which sometimes has allowed an assumption of the positive, sort of a linear positivist sort of a perception on the impact of telegraphy in India. Now, all of these authors that I have mentioned on the side, just to give you a glimpse of what my bibliography looks like, I'm extremely inspired by the research of Deepkanta Lahiri Chaudhary, who's done some phenomenal work on telegraphic imperialism in India. He does address an earlier period to me, but a lot of his modes of analysis and this focus on the Telegraph Department is inspired by his focus. The other scholar that I would like to mention who has influenced this particular chapter quite heavily is David Cannadine. So David Cannadine, in his book Ornamentalism, puts forward I would argue, a slightly controversial way of looking at colonialism. He argues that rather than race as sort of the medium or the means of colonial discrimination, another medium that's important for us to remember is class. And through my research into the Telegraphic Department, especially in 1920, class has emerged as a much more thorough and a much more nuanced way of looking at the Telegraph Department. And now, why do I say that? In 1920s, around that time, there was a policy of Indianization that was enforced through the Lee Commission, which enforced a 25% restriction on the number of British officers that could be employed within the Telegraph Department. Now, that is a fundamental change in how the Telegraph Department was, the demographics of it worked, and it changed a lot of how the office now was structured, both emotionally and also physically. What was once a domination of British and Anglo-Indian officers in the superior services, for example, in the administrative services, now is turned on its head. And we have a sort of Macaulay's men or deracinated Indian sort of population that's occupying the sort of top half of the Indian Telegraph Department. And then the subordinate staff is dominated by increasingly Indians from all over India, and also some Anglo-Indians who are getting pushed out of the superior services. So it is this moment of change that I focus on in this chapter and throughout my research as well. So I argue that telegraphy was a modality of colonial power. It was a means by which colonial power was enforced in India. And as an example, within the Telegraph Department, I identify three means by which, and this will sound suspiciously Foucaultian, but it is Foucaultian inspired by his analysis. It is an epistemic or an ideological kind of oppression that was enforced through the department, a bodily control, a bodily sort of regulation, and as well as a spatial control that was enforced within the department. And I'll take you through each of them in due time. The first one is epistemic, and this is where I borrow very, very heavily from scholars such as Ashish Nandi and Homi Bhabha's analysis of the psychology of colonization and the impact it has emotionally. I look at Deepak Kumar's work, Raj Chandrakar's work, and Prajit Ramnath's work about the pedagogy of science education in India. My assertion here largely is that the deprioritization of India, or the rejection, one can argue slightly more strongly, the rejection of Indian sciences or an Indian ability to understand sciences was a part of colonial ideology. They and it had varied sort of responses from society. Some Indian scholars, some Indian scientists completely accepted this assertion of colonial dominance or colonial enlightenment access to science, or enlightenment ability to understand rational science. Many scientists or scholars retreated from the discourse entirely, and they went into sort of a personal sphere, a spiritual or religious sphere, without, protecting the interior from this public discourse on science. The other option was that many of them attempted to explain Indian science through the lens of Western rationality. In all of these responses, what is clear is that there was a clear hierarchization of Western scientific ability above Indian scientific ability. And what one needs to realize and challenge is when Deepak Kumar argues that science and technology were two sides of the same coin. I would like to challenge that. And I believe that many Indians in 1920s colonial India, they did not think of technology as something that they could play around with or fiddle around with. That sense of ownership of technology was not present or was not offered to the Indian populace, especially the ones working in the department. So if you imagine, if you were a staff member of the Indian department, you would be working on machinery, but there is a disconnect with how much you are able to own or navigate or move around or tweak this technology. So you don't have the access to that. A reason why this access, and that I think is a very crucial thing that they managed to achieve, is to get workers to work on the infrastructure without having the confidence of being able to change or own the infrastructure, was a very crucial ideological victory that the colonial empire had to win, because essentially they wanted a de-skilled manual labor force. They did not want a school of scientists to emerge out of this training that they offered to the Indians. Now, there are many reasons given to us about why this segregation of pure sciences and applied sciences and hierarchization that happened alongside it happened. But one thing that really interests me is P.C. Ray's argument about how the logic of caste comes into being, where the applied sciences or pure sciences becomes something that upper castes are able to get more access to and play around with, or interact with, whereas the applied sciences, say metallurgy or say other like sort of hand working with hand and technology, was sort of de-skilled and made not as important. And a lot of traditional knowledge about metal work, for example, or ceramic work or other types of technology, was made the ambit of a lower caste and therefore lower in importance. Now, the Indian Telegraph Department and the telegraph sort of ecosystem in many ways goes ahead and adopts this segregation of applied and pure sciences and implements it throughout sort of the life career of a telegraph worker, right? A telegraph officer. And the way I argue this is I look at a lot of autobiographies and life stories of telegraph workers. And this is where I feel that my research stands a little bit uniquely in the historiography, that I have managed to access autobiographies of not only telegraph officers, but also subordinate workers in the telegraph office, which is rather unheard of in this historiography. I must admit that some of the autobiographies of subordinate workers have been positioned as semi-fictional in the literature. We can have a discussion about this at the very end, but for the time being, I'm reading against the grain and using these sources as a glimpse into the experience of the Indian subordinate. So this sort of segregation of applied sciences and pure sciences had an impact and a stamp on many levels of education and training. The first being, before you entered the department, you would have to either have a university degree or you would have to join a particular institution that would train you to become a telegraph officer, to pass the examination for a telegraph officer. And a thorough study of the syllabus of these universities and the syllabus of the examination papers has shown that there is a very clear demarcation of who is studying the theoretics of science and who is studying just practical ability or fixing of machines and other sort of. There is a very clear obsession amongst officers when you have to pass exams with physics, very heavy physics, mathematics, applied mathematics, a lot of literature and other theories as well. Whereas the draftsmen or where the Indians would enter the department, you would have much, much less theory and a focus on applied technology in many ways. This then goes ahead and gets reinforced in how they are trained when they're in the department. So just as an example, at the bottom here, you have a picture of a lovely gentleman. His name is M.S. Kalyana Sundaram. Now, M.S. Kalyana Sundaram is a very, very interesting gentleman who writes a book called The Autobiography of an Unknown Telegraphist. And this is a very, very interesting glimpse into what an Indian subordinate officer in Agra, stationed in Agra in 1922, faced. So Murthy, he is an upper class. He's a Brahmin from down south, and he's now joined Agra. He gives us a very interesting glimpse into this sort of alienation that the employees were feeling, because they were at the same time working with machines, but they were being told that they were not smart enough, that they were not capable enough, and there was this reiteration of this assumption of, for the lack of a better word, dumbness in many ways. So Murthy is talking to a friend of his. They have created something called the Thinkers Circle, where they basically get together and chat. And a couple of men are talking about how they feel very emasculated. They say this line wherein they say, if a woman wants to have power within the family, she should marry a telegraphist, not a lawyer or an officer, because the telegraphist is the only one who has the least power in the house. He earns the least, he's considered the least capable, he's considered somebody who doesn't have sort of very high intellectual capacity. And they say that we just keep doing the same thing again and again. There's an idea of repetition, there's an idea of almost mechanical working, which is not reflective of them thinking of themselves as scientists or technicians or people who are engaging with science in a very intellectual level. And there is an argument that Murthy replies and says, no, it is our job. It is our job to get information and pass it on, type A for A, B for B, and not process any of the information. So he, in many ways, has instrumentalized himself. He has made himself devoid of any agency in this matter. He is just a machine. And that, I believe, is a very, very interesting argument that he makes when it comes to how he feels when he's inside the department. Now, contrasting it to the top picture you see on the side here, this is a small picture which is a very interesting document. It's an autobiography called Dust and Snow, Half a Lifetime in India. It is by an officer called Conrad Reginald Cook. It was very few publications were made of this autobiography just for the family. I acquired one from his great-great-grand niece. And this is an officer of the department, same time as Murthy. Murthy is in Agra and Cook is currently, I think he was in Ajmer when he first joined. And Cook has a very different perspective to telegraphy. When Cook arrives in India, he brings with him a small telegraph machine of his own. And he's part of many amateur clubs and he does a lot of tinkering. And in the middle of the Second World War, he's sending messages which is illegal. He's trying to connect with somebody in Sri Lanka. So there is a very different level of ownership of this technology that both these officers have, which is very, very interesting to me. So the epistemic discipline that was imposed in the department made Murthy feel very differently about himself as compared to Cook. Murthy felt less like a man, he felt inferior, he felt alienated from his own work. The second modality that I wanted to talk about is the modality of the body. There is a very interesting concept that I want to introduce here called biomorality. And this is something that I've been inspired by. It essentially is a concept that was very prevalent in sort of early in 20th century, which is the connecting of the body and of moral values. That is to say that cleanliness, happiness, healthiness is a moral decision, is reflective of a moral personality. And therefore, if a body is not hygienic or clean or proper, it is necessarily immoral, and there's a decision of agency. There's a choice that you are choosing to be immoral when your body is in a particular state that is considered not optimal. Now, in this part of my research, in this part of my argument, I've been very inspired by the two gentlemen you can see on the side here. The bottom is Professor Gregory Downey from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He wrote a wonderful paper in 2002 on messenger boys, telegraph messenger boys, where he does a very interesting analysis of the office, telegraph office, and where they were located within the office. It's quite fascinating. I would recommend it. And the top picture is Michael Fegan. He's just published his, submitted his PhD thesis in earlier this year in March from the University of Western Ontario. And his general assessment is that the labor of the telegraphist has been, it's been abstracted. The body hasn't been focused on. Whereas he argues that the task of a telegraphist is a very bodily experience, it's a very heavy physical experience. And both of these arguments form a crucial part of my assessment. Now, my assessment of the bodily regulation within the department goes a step further from the epistemic. So once the mind has been influenced in a particular manner, it is reinforced by control of the body. Now, there is some element of bodily movement, but we'll come to that in the last part of my presentation, which is the space, but just touching upon two basic themes, right? Just an example I want to give you is the uniform. So as you might remember, 1920s was a time where the ruling class or the ruling class of the Indian Telegraph Department is no longer a visually segregated class. It is no longer an Anglo-Indian and British class. There are lots of Indian members who are joining. You have director generals like Gagan Roy, who has already become an Indian director general. So color or race is no longer the segregation between the ruled and the ruler. What is the new way of then separating these two categories within the Indian department? I argue that that was essentially the uniform. So by segregating the subordinate and the superior, and by enforcing a uniform on the subordinate classes, was how they managed to segregate these two classes. Now, it was these two classes were in principle supposed to be that you could escalate from the subordinate to the superior. However, in practice, that was rarely the case. It was essentially a class demarcation that they wanted to reinforce, which is something that I argue. Now, the uniform in many ways achieves many things at one time. The first thing it achieves is that it's able to separate the superior from the subordinate. So even though there are brown faces and people within the superior, the segregation is a matter of what they are wearing, which is made very, very clear. The second thing is that it applies a unanimity, a sort of a homogeneity on the entire subordinate class. Suddenly they look the same and they're supposed to behave the same. Whereas within the subordinate class, what we are often ignorant of is that there is a lot of clash of ethnicity, religion, caste, gender, which often gets overlooked. So a wonderful glimpse I got into this was when MS Kalyansundaram, for example, when he reaches Agra and he gets promoted, he is given a house near the telegraph office, and he as a Brahmin from the south, he is told that this house was previously occupied by a Bengali family. Now, our young telegraphist around the age of 25 goes ahead and gets a priest from the south to come and clean the house a couple of times to ritually purify it, because the previous residents were meat eaters. Now, that gives us a glimpse of what it was to be suddenly cramped into a space which is not respectful of your ethnic or your caste or your religious necessities, and to be thrown into this sort of new proto-modern office space, and what that does to a mentality of a young telegraphist as well. So one very good example of what was the result of the uniform suddenly enforcing a unanimity on a very diverse set of people is a resistance from within the department. So, for example, if I can give you an example of the hat on top, the brown hat, if you can see, that's called a solar topi. Shola topi. It was essentially a part of the colonial uniform, protection from the sun, and it was a very, very colonial visual in many ways. It was a part of what it meant to be a frontier colonial man. Now, in the 1940s, there was a proposal to make the solar topi a part of the uniform for the subordinate classes. And my documents tell me that there was an immediate opposition against this proposal, both from subordinate and superior classes. And their arguments are very, very interesting. The superior classes resisted this very, very interestingly because of a problem of aesthetics. And this is where we can get a Pierre Bourdieu argument about the aesthetics of taste. The superior classes were completely aghast that something which is as respected as a shola topi could be given to the subordinate classes. And how dare they appropriate that kind of image? And it's very interesting that they oppose it because, they say things like, oh, the Sikh members of the subordinate would not wear it. But the issue there is not a religious opposition. It is an aesthetic opposition, that they don't want this symbol to be a symbol of the superior classes. A very interesting argument again is a sort of a suppression of a caste/caste identity. Very often in my documents, I don't find an obvious statement of caste pride, but often it's camouflaged in a class pride of sorts. So you have even amongst the supporting staff, for example, the sweepers, the cleaners, the water bringers, there is an opposition within them of wearing the same uniform as well. So you have people who are farashes, who are sort of cleaners in the office, who say, I will not wear some cloth, for example, a khadi cloth that is worn by a sweeper, because I earn more than the sweeper, so I would not wear whatever they are wearing. So it is in these sort of glimpses of subaltern agency of opposition within the department that you can get a glimpse of what they are resisting, this unanimity that the department wants to impose on them. Sports became another way that the body was controlled and branded as inferior. And sports has been, obviously, this is prevalent argumentation that sports was a means by which the imperial body was celebrated. It was on display. It was sort of on tour, be it cricket, be it hockey, be it rowing. It was one of the ways that by which the imperial body was shown to be superior and more capable than the emasculated, feminized Indian body. But in the department, you get a very clear agenda behind sports, whereas every telegraph office had a sporting team, and they would internally play against, say, the railways or other engineering groups, and this would escalate to a national level as well. What is very interesting for me to note is that through Murthy's autobiography, we get an example where Murthy was very interested in playing tennis. Now he goes and asks to play tennis, but he is told that he can't afford to book the court for a long enough time or to buy a tennis ball. Eventually, he realizes the only way he can play the sport of tennis is if he takes the discarded tennis balls from other officers, uses them, and then eventually sells it to even poorer Indians within the department who will get a twice used ball to play with. So while sports was the measure of an imperial body, access to sports was never granted to Indian bodies, where they had to jump many hoops to even begin to qualify in the sports. And that became a tautological argument that the Indian body is not physically fit, without realizing that the access was never given to it in the first place. So these are two arguments that I wanted to create here. Coming to the second, sort of wrapping up my argumentation here, I talk about the spatial analysis of the postal office as well. Here, many of you will recognize the picture on the right side as the Bombay post office. The Bombay post office also had a telegraph office within that. So that's just a clarification I want to make. You had certain telegraph offices separate from post offices, but often they were combined, especially towards the second half of the 20th century. Now, it is a dual argument and a very interesting double-edged sword of many ways. The first argument I make is that the post office was a very crucial part of the sort of principal colonial architecture that was a statement of power. So I call this the post office fort complex, but what one can do, maybe with a better name for it eventually, is I wanted to understand, if you look at the geography of either the Bombay or the Kolkata or even the Delhi post office, it is often built very in close proximity to the colonial fort, to other symbols of colonial power, be it for example, with Bombay, Victoria Terminus, or be it other sort of examples of large-scale domination of British architecture. A very good example of this is the Indo-Saracenic architecture that the Bombay Post Office was built in. The Indo-Saracenic, for those of us who are slightly unfamiliar with this, is a combination of what sort of Indian-inspired architecture and colonial architecture in many ways. They adopt the Mughal onion dome instead of the Greco-Roman dome that one can see in a previous building, for example, the Kolkata Post Office. Now, if you compare the Bombay and Kolkata, you can see a very, very clear European influence in the Kolkata Post Office. But by the time they make the Bombay Post Office just 25 years later, it has become very Indianized. So the symbol of power, the visual of power has now shifted. It has become that we are a part of this country's symbology of power. We are not bringing something foreign. And I do have an autobiography, sort of a contemporaneous record by this gentleman called Innocent Souza, who's written a book called Sorrows of the Sub-Postmaster, a wonderful book where he addresses clerks within the post office. And Innocent Souza talks about the Bombay Post Office as an edifice of Indian architecture as opposed to foreign architecture, which is very symbolic in this moment. So the grandeur of the post office fort complex, the sort of apogee of colonial architecture, is massive and is grand and is making a statement. But when you step into it and step into the office of the telegraph officer, the picture on the left-hand side, I must admit, is not of a post office. It is from Thomson College in Roorkee, present-day IIT Roorkee, and this was a draftsman's classroom. So this is the closest visual I could get to a telegraph office, but you have to please do forgive me for not having the picture. So the interior of the post office, we get descriptions of this from both Murthy's autobiography, from Ramesh Chandra's book as well, and from an autobiography by an Anglo-Indian called Charles Coverdale that I'm working with. Now, these rooms are the opposite of what the post office looks from the outside. They are described often as very dusty, very loud, so that the sonic experience is extremely stressful. It's often, Murthy describes it as sort of a bomb waiting to explode, essentially, where he constantly feels that somebody's going to throw him under the bus, somebody's going to yell at him. Very interestingly, actually, in his first day at work, he was on the Agra-Gwalior line, and somebody very quickly sort of transmitted and said GTH to him, and he didn't understand what GTH means. He goes to his telegraph master and asks. Apparently it meant go to hell, because he was typing so slowly, everybody was getting frustrated by him. So he talks about it as a very stressful space. It's something that he doesn't appreciate being within. And descriptions of telegraph offices are very interesting. They talk about sort of a panopticon perspective, or sort of that the telegraph master needs to be able to see all the telegraphists and surveil their productivity, how fast they are transmitting, how often they're getting off their chairs. For example, there's a statement by the Postmaster General C.R. Clarke where he says that even the access to the washroom used to be once per shift, and the shift could last between 8 hours and 12 hours. The washroom had to be inside the office. It could only be accessed by one door, and the main door to the office also should be such that the postmaster can see every member of the office in one go. So you see a very clear indication of a panopticon control within the office space, which is very interesting. Towards the latter half of the 1950s, 1940s, we get these campaigns of Cleanliness Week and Courtesy Week. And on the face of it, it seems very positive and very nice. But as we think of it, also through articles in the Times of India, we understand that these two weeks had to be imposed onto the department because there was a very blatant lack of courtesy and lack of cleanliness within these departments, where some telegraphists were recommended don't wear black clothes because it is so dusty and there's so much of ink all over the office that it will just completely ruin your outfit as well. So it was almost like a departmental acknowledgement that this is how the office is going to be, which I find very, very fascinating. If you compare it with Cook, Conrad Reginald Cook's description of his own office, he gives us a very different picture. He gives us an idea of a pristinely clean office with a very well-dressed chowkidar on the outside wearing an achkan, a very, very fancy kurta and a very nice turban, who keeps saying Ji Huzur to this colonial officer. And this officer describes his work as, oh, my secretary takes care of all the paperwork. All I have to do is just sign this is my entire contribution is signing documents on a day-to-day basis. So you can understand the value of the labor by the value of the space that's given to the labor, and what the space makes the labor feel in certain situations as well. Oh, sorry. Just bringing my talk today to a sort of slow, gradual close. So these three elements form the main crux of my argument, which is that essentially science and technology, as we all know, are not neutral mediums that are introduced into the Indian subcontinent under this garb of the department being a meritocratic department, a department that only allows, so they have very clear indication that we will not take bribery, we will not take any other nomination or any recommendation. It is only based on your intellectual ability. Behind this garb of meritocracy or scientific development, telegraphy was actually a means by which colonial ideology, colonial hierarchization was imposed. It was done but very subliminally. It was done very in a very sort of nuanced manner. It was done with the collaboration of scientific schools, scientific institutions such as IIT, such as Thomason College, such as the Royal Engineering Institute in London, and it was sort of it attacked the telegraphist's life in many ways. It attacked his conception of himself through epistemology. It attacked his conception of his bodily ability by not allowing him to show sort of that he is not biomorally compromised in many ways. It controlled not just how he presented himself to the society, to himself, to his friends, to his colleagues, to his superiors. It controlled how often he could go to the washroom, for example. It controlled his day-to-day work. So we all know about how stressful telegraphic work was and how much of an impact it would have on, for example, the telegraphist's cramp or your eyesight, to give you a couple of examples. It also impacted how he moved around in his office space. So through a constant almost surveillance and control of the telegraphist's body, that Indian Telegraph Department was very crucial in how science and technology was introduced in India with the intention of de-skilling as opposed to enhancing of skill. And that brings me to the end of my lecture. I would be very, very happy to receive any questions from the panel. Before I leave, I would just like to mention that I have curated an exhibition on my work, which is currently on tour through London and the Southwest. I'll be very happy to share details of it with anybody interested. And if anybody has any other venues in mind, I would really appreciate that too. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Shibani, for that excellent explication and outlining of some of the key ideas underpinning your work. I would now like to invite Dr. Amelia Bonea as the first discussant to, give a response and, have a further dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I would also like to say thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. It's also, as Sanjay said, my first time joining the GlobalSouth network, and I also wanted to thank Shibani for the fascinating talk. My doctoral dissertation was also on the history of telegraphy in colonial South Asia, with an emphasis on how it was used to report news. Mm-hmm. So your talk took me back to those happy days of researching the history of the telegraph at the National Archives in Delhi and the British Library. And while listening to it, I remembered that indeed one of the most difficult aspects of that work was trying to document the Indian staff that worked for the Telegraph Department, or really the people who built the telegraph network to begin with, because my work was focusing mostly on the second half of the 19th century. And I think it's a problem that those of us who have worked with colonial records are well aware of. They rarely mention the South Asians who kept that department up and running, or the lines up and running, unless something goes wrong. And someone needs to take the blame for it. And that's when people will pop out of a sudden. So this is all to say that I really appreciate your approach to the topic, and I think it's particularly relevant in these days and times when we tend to take for granted the materiality of telecommunications technologies, the amount of human labor that is actually required for them to function seamlessly. And the other thing I discovered while working on this topic is that the telegraph was not only an instrument of colonial power, but also for me, and this was a very important part to document, an instrument of resistance to that colonial power, right? And that brings us to the question of agency that kept cropping up in your talk, and I thought it was great. In my case, for example, when Indian newspaper editors decided to publish Reuters telegraphs without actually subscribing to its service because it was simply too expensive to pay for it, right? So again, just to say that I'm really sympathetic with your approach to this topic. And there are two other comments that I wanted to make, and they're somehow interrelated and connected again to the fact that we have met here today under the umbrella of the GlobalSouth network, which presumably also means that we are interested in studying the history of technoscience from decolonial perspectives as well. And I guess my question here really is how, just to push you a bit more on this topic, so you don't have to come up with a perfect answer now. How would a history of telegraphy in colonial South Asia look like that seeks to theorize from a global South perspective, not only from a global North perspective? And you mentioned this in the beginning of your talk in relation to producing technological or scientific knowledge. The distinction between who can theorize and who cannot theorize, who applies science, right, is very clear. Especially when we study the history of technoscience in colonial context. And it just strikes me that very often we talk about decolonization and the global South, but we don't always challenge that well-entrenched distinction between who theorizes and who provides the case studies, right? And Arthur Asraf engaged with this question in his brilliant book Electric News in Colonial Algeria, in which he uses a lot of sources in Arabic, for example. So this is just one very broad question to keep in mind. I've been interested in this and trying. I cannot claim that I have the right answer to it, right? But I've been thinking about it a lot. How to escape this problem of applying the theoretical insights of researchers who are based say at Anglo-American institutions, and then for the rest of us just provide case studies, right? Just for context, I am from Eastern Europe, from Romania, so I'm very much aware of this problem by virtue of my own background as well, right? And then related to this question, and also how gender shapes research on the history of technology, in South Asia and beyond. It's again a problem that we are, I think, most of us are very much aware of. Female scholars tend to be underrepresented in the history of technology, and I think this is already evident from the selection of secondary sources you presented, right? So I've been very concerned also because in recent years I've been doing research on the history of women in STEM. I've been very concerned about how to change this situation, and I think we have a duty as scholars, to try to change things, and it should probably start, with actively making an effort to engage with the works of those who have written on this and related topics. And I'm thinking here about scholars like, in the British context, for example, Emily Ruiz-Kerner and Emily Bratton, who have worked extensively on the history of women in telecommunications. Closer to South Asia, there is Abba Suar's brilliant book on caste, gender, and modern science, which I think really deserves more press, and offers a very good template for how to engage with gender, caste, which again cropped up in your discussion, class and technoscience in colonial South Asia. And I use it to teach, and I often wonder why it is missing from the required leading lists of the history of science courses. And it's not about telegraphy, but it is about physics, right? And there's a lot of physics when we talk about telegraphy. So I feel that it might be relevant here as well, right? And then moving from researchers to the actual subjects of research, is there any place for women and gender in this story you're documenting. And you already mentioned, I thought it was very, very interesting. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Was it in relation to Murthy's account when you mentioned that if a woman wants to have power in the house, she should marry a telegraphist, right? So that's already a very gendered statement, right? That deserves some unpacking probably in the context of your research. And I was also wondering if there is room for any female telegraphists. I don't know the answer to this because I said I worked on the 19th century, but I know there were female telephone operators in Bombay in the first half of the 20th century, right? So I was wondering whether this comes at all into play in your study. There are other smaller comments, but I'll just stop here because I don't want to overshoot my time. But again, thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk and I learned a lot. So I'm really excited to see that you're working on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amelia. Fascinating comments here. I'm just writing down on my end here. And I next invite Dr. Bhumika Billa for a second discussant and to open up further comments. Welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Shibani. That was fascinating. And I'm not a historian. I am based in, I've trained all my life in a law faculty, but I'm very interested in communication technologies, the idea of coding, decoding information, and who holds the power and how do lived experience and identities of the encoders or decoders seep into the information. So all of this was super fascinating. So thanks for the invite as well, Norman. It was, really fascinating for me to be here. I would just second Amelia's comment on gender. I had a similar question. So I'll not state the question out loud, but yes, I would love to hear what you found about gender and the place of gender in your archives as well, or your method as well. I also had a couple of comments on the broader narrative. So I'm not sure where you are planning to place the chapter or what is the broader context. So forgive me if I'm shooting questions that go way beyond the scope, but feel free to say that. And also I'd be curious to know what future directions you have in mind for this. So the first question I had was, you mentioned that you look at how these regimes also persist beyond 1947. So I was curious to know whether you comment on how did these colonial class distinctions continue to reinforce these hierarchies after independence, maybe immediately after independence, and perhaps even how do they reflect in communication technologies in India even today, if at all that's I know that I understand that's way beyond the scope of your kind of temporal focus, but even if you can hint at the future direction that these hierarchies took these technologies in. And related to that, how do you see technology itself as a correlating device between past, present, and future in terms of especially social hierarchies, inequalities, and whether at all your broader argument is leaning towards decoupling the idea of progress from the idea of innovation or evolution, technological evolution at all. So just approaching this more from an economic understanding of information, evolution, progress. So how do you bring that in conversation with a more cultural studies orientation of these questions? The second question I had was about the information itself. So did you have a chance to look at what was being communicated and whether the control exerted by those in the higher sort of strands of this labor hierarchy within the office, whether that kind of control had any direct implication? I'm sure it did, but did you find evidence of that? And do you touch upon that at all in your thesis? I was curious to know what was being communicated, and how did this panopticon not only operate within the internal labor relations of the office itself or surveillance at the workplace, but also extended beyond in the larger society, and also the entire nationalist movement as well, if there's any correlation between that in your evidence. And then my final question relates to the idea of merit. And I feel like this is such an exciting project because you touch upon so many different strands uh, of merit, of epistemic injustice. And also, speaking of epistemic injustice, you might, sorry if you've already come across this work, but like I just wanted to point you to Miranda Fricker's work on epistemic injustice. She's a philosopher. And then building on her, there's Jana Bakiewicz as well, who's a sociologist who talks about epistemic positioning. So her work, your work reminded me directly of that in terms of how within these labor offices, the Indian workforce was epistemically positioned differently from those in the imperial office. Yes, so building on that, my question or comment or just like some thoughts were about whether you've managed to connect the pathways of mobilization within these offices with the pathways in sports or other pathways, and how all of these aggregatedly led to like changing or shifting the notion of merit in generally in the Indian society. And how did that further seep into the hierarchies of knowledge production? Because you very interestingly refer to the syllabus of segregated syllabus of applied and theoretical sciences. So, how did this shifting notion of merit in sports, in labor, and in education kind of come together in the context of telegraphers, and how what that represents about the wider kind of meritorious or notions of meritocracy in the Indian society? Yeah, thank you so much. Those were my limited comments and questions.
Thank you, Bhumika, for your comments, and I hope those who are on also joining us, about 30 of those scholars and others. We will get to you in a little bit. We will now have Shreya Kaun, PhD candidate. She will be a peer commentator from the University of Warwick. Welcome, Shreya.
Yeah. Thanks, Shivani, for your talk. It was really exciting. I was thinking parallelly about my own project, which is similar, not similar, but I work on coal and coal extraction in Northeast India. So, and your comment on applied sciences did make me think because the whole idea of de-skilling a population to make them work in a system was making me think about how about the stuff that I come across when I'm looking at the northeast of India, and even if I'm looking at like metallurgy, and I think there's a lot, like when I'm looking at geologists and their journal accounts, there's a lot of information that is exchanged in terms of like the pre-colonial iron works, iron traditions that are there in the Khasi Hills and the Khasi communities, and how geologists who are actually exploring that terrain are almost building up on a pre-existing tradition, you know. So the intellectual dialogue that goes on field between a scientific practitioner who is part of the empire and someone who's a local community, it's really interesting how that works. So in my context, in my case, I wouldn't call it de-skilling. I mean, even though coal is a heavily manual, labor intensive industry, but there is so much intellectual exchange that even happens in those spaces that it's really interesting for me to see that. And I was wondering if that's an angle that you might want to consider. I don't know. But like, I'm sure because you're in a different stage of your PhD, you've already come across like things that are making you think otherwise. The other question that I had was the telegraphic system in itself, like the whole mechanism of it, which is how cables were laid and how that system in itself makes it actually a very intercontinental system in many ways, you know, and it connects India to so many other places and so many different colonial contexts. like how the materials that are used to insulate a telegraph cable in itself is connecting India to Southeast Asia. So and the extractive regimes in Southeast Asia. So just to understand, like, I know your project says it in what's Indian about the Indian telegraph system, but I'm just thinking of more in terms of like a global history perspective and how the telegraph system is actually a very global system in itself. So I think these were just some of like comments, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. Just a quick note before we, give the back to Shibani to talk about and respond to the discussants. Regarding the global history, I recently wrote a paper on in the Third World Quarterly about the neoliberalism's antecedent histories, looking at the colonial conjunctures, where certainly gender was a absent figure there. It's like mostly I was looking at the way in which telegraph reincarnates itself in the sense of in the contemporary West Asia. So my focus was on extractive regimes in the West Asian region. I connected with ideas of labor, like there's a scholar, Sebastian Rose, in the UK, who's written extensively about Armenian workers, and he looked at the Indo-European Telegraph Department, which was like Lashkars and others like Armenian, Anglo-Indians, and people from South India, Mumbai, Bombay, and Karachi, and Tehran, not Tehran, some Isfahan in Iran. That was the linking of the global nexus within the colonial. So interesting observations, Shreya. Now to Shibani, can respond to the discussants and Shreya's comments.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sanjay, and everybody for the entire panel for their thoughts and questions. These are all wonderful. I've made a lot of notes, so do excuse me if I miss out on any questions, and you can always let me know if I've done so. So I'll try and go sort of chronologically according to questions, and starting off with Professor Bonea's comments. Thank you so much. I mean, your work has been quite influential in my own research. So it's such a pleasure to have you and have you comment on my work, which is fascinating. So on the two ideas of what would a South Asian perspective on the history of telegraphy look like, that's a wonderful question. I'm so glad that you mentioned and that you recognize how difficult it is to find Indian voices, because for a large part of my research, I really struggled with it. And I kept hitting my head against the wall trying to find some Indian agency, which is why I think the life histories approach I have taken for my research is very, very unique in its ability of giving me a glimpse at least of what it was from their perspective. I am not entirely sure what a South Asian, and I do agree that it's not an answer I can give off the top of my head at the moment, and it's something for me to consider. But I was just thinking back to Deepkanta Lahiri Chaudhary's work, and he, I think, is the only person that I can think of the top of my head who refers to a Bengali treatise on electrical telephony and telegraphy. I've been on the hunt for sort of Indian sources on telegraphy as well, but I haven't found too much. I found some labor documentation, I found some literature, but not a scientific treatise, which is underwhelming. All I can do is I can sort of support what you are saying, because even in Murthy's narrative, he adopts this Western epistemological angle, and he sort of states in very anguish. He gives me a list in his autobiography of all the Western books he has read. So he wants to make it evidently clear that he's part of this Western knowledge system, right? And despite this, and he talks about how he himself has invented a way of making the Bunyan switch a more efficient switch. Essentially, a Bunyan switch is a Y switch. You can switch between circuits. And Murthy comes up with his own way of making that a little bit more efficient. He goes to his boss, his immediate telegraph inspector, and says, listen, I have an idea. Can we please crack on this? And the officer is a British officer, and he completely rejects Murthy, all with the statement that, do you think if you have thought of this, nobody else could have thought of this? And if you have thought of it, somebody else has already said this. So the Murthy is giving us this frustration that he himself considers himself a part of the Western epistemological world. He, as an English-speaking South Indian, thinks of himself as superior than his Northern Indian colleagues very often. But even then, he's not able to crack in and become one of those who are the inventors, as opposed to the theoretics as opposed to the applicants. So I think that will be a quest for my own self about figuring out what a South Asian perspective to this looks like. There's a very interesting book on a centenary of Indian Telegraph Department written by Krishnalal Sridharani, and I have scanned that book so much to even find one glimpse of Indian sort of invention or contribution, but Sridharani doesn't do a very good job of it. He mentioned something called the tongue test, which he said was an Indian invention, that you could see if the wire is electrically charged by touching it onto your tongue. But again, that somehow seems like a trivialization of Indian invention and Indian contribution to me. So I'm still looking for that sort of perception. Early documents by IIT Roorkee, which used to be Thomson College, an engineering college, also openly states that the British officers were the ones who meant for scientific training, and Indians, if trained well, because of their acclimatization to the climate and linguistic ability, can be efficient or useful if they are trained very, very well. So even the department, or even schools within India, or IIT as such a big institution, is admitting very openly that Indians were meant for a very different purpose. So I'll definitely try and answer that question, Amelia, at some point. The gender angle, both with Bhumika's and Amelia's question, is something that I have very intentionally left out of this presentation. The reasons for that are largely that I don't have any sources where women are speaking of their own selves. So I have sources where men are speaking of what women are going through. And it just felt to me that Murthy, for example, goes on very, very long narratives about his wife's life and all of that, but it's from a male perspective. So I was still looking for sources that give me a true woman's voice within the department. Amelia might know this better than I do, and Sridharani admits it, that where towards the very, very end of, even after Second World War, the Indian Telegraph Department only then began to hire women as telegraphists. In the Second World War, there was a law that was repealed, which was that married women cannot be in the telegraph department. So Second World War, they allowed married women to come in, but the number was about 20% of the entire workforce, even at the point of independence. So it was a very, very small group. You are right, Amelia, by pointing out that there were telephone operators. Venus Green's work on telephone operators in Bell is very, very interesting on that front. But just before I move on, I wanted to mention I have referenced some scholars, female scholars within this chapter that I should have mentioned, especially when it comes to a social biography of railways. So there's a very, very interesting work done by Laura Baer, for example, on railways and the life of society within railways. You have some very interesting work by Ananya Pandey Sharma, who does some work on dark houses, so dark postal guest houses, which also becomes a part of my spatial analysis, but I left that out just because of paucity of time. So when it comes to Antoinette Burton's work on domesticity and the space as well, that's been incorporated by me. But I will admit that science and technology, that sort of chunk, we definitely need more women scholars, and I'll definitely read the book that you recommended, Amelia, and try to incorporate that. Before I move on to Bhumika's point, I wanted to just mention the really nice arguments or sort of juicy anecdotes that I've left out of my thesis. Murthy, for example, he pushed his wife to become a telegraphist as well, which is the first indication that we get of him, because he wanted some extra money, he wanted more income, so he makes his wife go to join the telegraph department. His wife is very opposed to this. She says, no, I can't go to the telegraph office, because what if I get my menstrual cycle and the office space, which is a holy space, will get contaminated. And which is when Murthy sort of launches into these sort of modernistic invectives about, oh, you should be like the Anglo-Indian woman who is able to work outside and with no problem whatsoever. So he gives a very moral argumentation to her, very justified reasoning. Eventually, what he does is, because he associates her ability to perform in the office with his pride, he basically steals a telegraph wire from his office, and he builds a telegraph line inside his house, connecting the kitchen to the living room. And he trains his wife to Morse code from the kitchen to the living room so that she can practice. He also gives us a very interesting insight about Anglo-Indian women being very good at telegraphy, because they used to have piano experience. and they were their finger mobility was very, very superior. That's why the Anglo-Indian woman was always better than the Indian woman. So I have these glimpses into the woman's life, but because I don't have them from the woman's voice, I'm a little bit nervous about how much I can lean on these sources as valuable sources to make an argument about gender within women's this thing about within the department. One thing I know is that as subordinate employees, Murthy's wife, Sumitra was her name. She was not. I mean, she was not. I would say not allowed to, but there was a sense in the department that you can't take leave. And I think that's a focus on productivity and efficiency. So whenever she had her menstrual cycle coming up, she would have to work extra hours for her friends so that they would take on her hours when she had her menstrual cycle coming up. So that's a very interesting argument about bodily disciplining for women personally. So there was never an option for her to just take leave or stay at home. She would often have to choose work over her child responsibilities as well. So many women in the locality were antagonistic towards Sumitra because Sumitra would leave her kids at home and go to work. And they would make comments on her capacity as a mother, for example. So I do have these sort of nuances, but again, as I mentioned, it's a little bit dicey for me without the right sources. Bhumika, thank you so much for your comments. The place where this chapter fits in the larger, and I can connect it to the future projects and post-independence continuities in one go. My entire thesis is looking at space as a very important means of analysis. It begins with in the home, so the domestic spaces of telegraph officers and telegraph employees, where I go into housing policy and I go into dark bungalows and I go into clubs as places of sociability. Then I go into the office, the workspace, which is this chapter that I have presented to you. I move on to the street, where I very directly talk about telegraphy and nationalism and its contribution to nationalism. In the end, I leave it at the archive, where I talk about how the problems I faced within the archive researching this project and my exhibition that came out and how it sort of navigated those things. So that's the sort of chronological order. The post-independence continuities, I can best answer that by clubbing it as well about your point about past, future, present, and future with technology. I found it very, very evident through my research that what I was expecting in many ways was that there will be a stark change with the moment of independence and how the labor is treated or how the department is treated. Now, you do have Pandit Nehru making comments such as the staff is the most important part of the department and we need to focus on the staff. So that's very evidently there. But what I perceive it as is more lip service than it is policy. So looking at just, for example, housing policy, I have some departments where I have some documents where the union, which was the different unions within the Telegraph Department were very, very strong. Deepan Talaheri also talks about this at great length. And they have a lot of argumentation about the housing policy for telegraphists. Often, even into independent India, how telegraphists in hill stations were made to wait up to 7 to 10 years to receive a housing accommodation that was legally considered unlivable. So they were kept out of. They were supposed to have permanent housing afforded by the post office, but the post office often did not do this. They would often be given. They would be taken away from their families, given very poor housing situations, often with mold, often with seepage, often with lack of access to clean water, and they have campaigned for years for just livable standard of residence, but that was often not offered to them at all. And this is despite the Congress being mobilized. Khurshid Lal, the Home Minister, was being mobilized personally to look into this matter. But even then, it took up to 7 years to give them even one, even sort of 50% of them to be given houses that were standard sort of living. If we compare this to labor conditions in the UK, in Britain, for example, housing conditions were much, much better, much, much earlier. You had as early as 1890s, if I'm not wrong, a committee that made it compulsory for every labor sort of factory to have multiple bathrooms with running water. That was something that our employees in the Indian Telegraph Department did not have even in the 1950s. So that's a very, very clear indication that I can tell you, at least with housing policy. But the global network, let me finish with that, Shreya. Thank you so much for that comment. I think what I have done is very intentionally stepped away from the global perspective of telegraphy. A reason for that might be just because I felt that historiographically it's been dominated by, for example, Daniel Hendricks's work or Michael Aras's work. It's always been looked at as a state mechanism of communication. And I realized that the missing piece over there was to look at it as take a more sort of subcontinental focus on it and look at it as the everyday history of technology in India, a little bit more on the lines of David Arnold's work with technology. But I'm very happy to take this question up further with you, as well as the idea of de-skilling and how metallurgy might be different a little bit, just because I do not think that there was an indigenous school of thought with radio, with sort of wireless communication that pre-existed. So therefore, they were, in some ways, in my understanding, working in a slightly blank canvas as compared to metallurgical or other means of materiality. But thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate the time, and I really appreciate your comments. It's going to go a long way in helping my thesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Shibani. Excellent, fascinating presentation here, Shibani, and I enjoyed, listening to Amelia and Bhumika and also Shreya. I just wrote down quite a few notes here. Just a quick comment here about de-skilling. I have not taken it in my essay, but the work of Eaton, I think he was talking about the Julahas of Agra, Kanpur, where the leather industries were, quite popular. And then when the British came in, they were engaging in laying out the cables in Kanpur out the region, which is the northern provinces in the North India, where some of the Julahas were also mobilized for laying the cable. So there was this whole idea of the wage labor that was put in place, which was a global trend, because you have people like Elizabeth Losh in the US Signal Corps, construction of telegraphic line, global resonances there. Then you have Hal Langford, who wrote about the subjugation of the Bororo Indians in Brazil, where the gender comes up here because the Bororo Indians are mobilized to put the cables and all of that, and the women were working, and women were producing the working matrilineal society. So there were some references there, but not in the domesticity of the telegraph office though, but it was in the cable laying. And then you have a fascinating work by Alejandra Bronfman, Cable Telegraphy in the Caribbean Region, again focusing on labor, race, class, gender issues. Fascinating work there. I had this comment about when you mention epistemic and bodily, and then the spatial as three modes of power, I was thinking of phenomenology of body. There's some theories of embodiment that people like the feminist orientations will look at how gender operates within the domestic settings. Might not be related directly to telegraph, but it could be in the area of communication and transportation. I think there's a work by Sinha and his group in UK which talk about transportation and looking at bullock carts and looking at other modes of mobility, and where how people where gender comes up, I think, in some ways. And there is this lastly interesting work by Own Barak, Israeli and scholar on Egypt, telegraph in Egypt, and there is some about the women there. It talks about the gender angle there. So these are some really interesting, writers, scholars who have been, working at looking at telegraph. And one final, note about, I think it's Fritz Morris, a PhD scholar at the Columbia University, looking at the environmental implications of telegraph in the United States when there were a lot of, logging was going on to, build that. So those are my quick comments. But if you're interested, I have some references in the article that I wrote for the Third World Quarterly, but happy to, talk with you. And with that, I conclude, and I appreciate, the participation. Again, Norman, for your invite and for organizing this for the Global South Network. I again thank Shibani, Bhumika, Amelia, and Shreya, and as well, Norman as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sanjay, for chairing the session. Thanks all for giving your comments and sharing your thoughts. I think I really enjoyed the discussion. Not only this session, every week I enjoy every second of the session. People from different parts of the world. I think the safe, inclusive, and diverse environment demands us to bring forward all these topics which are at the periphery of most of the time, mainstream academic discourse. I would like to conclude the session by saying the Global South Network warmly welcomes PhD students from all disciplines, all parts of the world, to share their research and receive interdisciplinary feedback. If you are interested in presenting your work or taking part in these sessions, you may wish to contact me. Next week, same time, we will be joined by Ying Zhu, PhD candidate, School of Law, University of Glasgow, who will present their PhD project titled Open Financial Regulatory Paradigm in China on 3rd of December. Until then, look after yourself. Take care. Bye-bye.